At 0700 on 19 July 1945, the Sea of Okhotsk looked almost peaceful. Low gray overcast. A light chop. The sort of morning that would have been boring anywhere else. Commander Eugene B. Fluckey, United States Navy, pressed his eye to the periscope of the fleet submarine USS Barb and watched a Japanese train curl along the shoreline of Karafuto like a black steel snake. The periscope optics turned the world into a small, tight circle. In that circle, the scene was sharp. A steam locomotive, white plumes smearing the cloudy sky. A string of boxcars and flat cars, some with tarps, some with men sitting on the roofs. Soldiers in field caps, legs dangling as they rode. Freight marked for the Japanese garrison at Kashiho. Fluckey watched it for a long moment. To most people, it was just a train. To him, it was logistics, ammunition, food, replacements, the moving bloodstream of Japan's last defensive line. If that train reached its destination, those men in that cargo would be waiting for whatever poor American units got ordered to assault Japan's northern flank. Marines, Army infantry, young kids who hadn't seen combat yet. In Barb's control room, the crew waited for his word. "Another one, skipper?" the exec asked quietly. Fluckey kept his eye to the glass. He'd been out here for 3 weeks, prowling the Sea of Okhotsk, looking for anything still moving. Japan's merchant navy had been slaughtered. What was left hugged the coasts or stayed in harbor. Trains were doing the work ships used to do. 6 trains a day, he'd been told. North and south along this rocky shoreline. 40 to 60 troops per run, plus supplies. 6 arteries feeding the same diseased heart. Fluckey straightened up from the periscope, eye red-ringed from the rubber cup. "Yes," he said finally, "another one. And this time, we're not just going to scare them." He looked around the cramped control room of this E-2400-ton Gato-class submarine. "We're going to kill a train." Silence, then a low, disbelieving chuckle from somewhere in the after compartment. Nobody had ever heard of a submarine killing a train, on land. On the home islands of Japan, by mid-1945, USS Barb was a legend in steel. She'd been launched in 1942. Just another Gato-class fleet boat, 10 torpedo tubes, a 4-inch deck gun, and 80 tired, oil-soaked men crammed inside a steel cylinder. But under Eugene Fluckey, Barb turned into something different. 5 war patrols with him in command, 17 enemy ships already sunk, 4 Presidential Unit Citations, 8 battle stars, a Navy unit commendation. But brass and paperwork never made a submarine deadly. The captain did. 6 months before this train, Fluckey had gone somewhere no sane submarine skipper should go, into Namkwan Harbor off China, January 1945. Depth too shallow to dive in safety. Minefields guarding the approach. Destroyers patrolling the entrance. Inside, 30 merchant ships at anchor, nested in what the Japanese thought was a steel womb. Doctrine said you stayed away from places like that. Torpedoes were fired from deep water, from outside defended harbors. You did not take a 300-foot submarine into a bathtub full of explosives. Fluckey went in anyway. He threaded Barb through uncharted water, ran up to periscope depth inside the harbor, and emptied his bow and stern tubes. 6 torpedoes, then 4 more. Explosions rippled across Namkwan like a giant had stomped in the bay. Masts toppled. Superstructures blew apart. Ships burned to the waterline. Then, while the Japanese scrambled to figure out which direction death had come from, Barb went full power on the surface, charging out at flank speed with depth charges and shells falling behind her in water too shallow to hide. 8 ships went down. Barb took no casualties. For that patrol, Fluckey received the Medal of Honor. The citation was full of words like conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life. Around the piers at Pearl Harbor, the real word people used was simpler: crazy. But it worked. Now, in June 1945, that same Medal of Honor skipper looked at a different kind of target and came up with a different kind of crazy. Because the war had changed. All those easy fat convoys were gone. Japanese shipping was dead or hiding. U.S. subs, once the wolves of the Pacific, were running out of prey. So when Fluckey got orders for Barb's 12th and final war patrol, he went to the Navy's research and development guys with an unusual request. Bolt a rocket launcher to my deck. The ordnance men blinked. The Mark 51 5-inch rocket launcher was being tested as an anti-kamikaze system for landing craft. 12 spin-stabilized rockets, each with a 10-pound high-explosive warhead, maximum range about 3 miles. Think of it as a mini naval barrage in a box. Nobody had planned to stick one on a submarine. Fluckey smiled that thin, almost shy smile of his. "Gentlemen," he said, "I can think of a few neighborhoods in Japan that would appreciate some fireworks." They relented. Welders went to work. When Barb left Midway on 8 June 1945, she carried the usual load of torpedoes and gun ammunition, and 72 rockets in a clumsy contraption mounted forward. On paper, she was still a submarine. In reality, she had become something else. A one-boat raiding squadron. Barb reached the waters north of Hokkaido on 20 June 1945. Fog. Cold. Fishing boats hugging the coastline. Japanese radar sweeping lazily. Still not believing that by this late stage of the war, American submarines would be bold enough to prowl so close. They were about to have that belief corrected. At 02:30, on 22nd June, Barb ran in close, 3 miles off the town of Shari on Hokkaido's shore. Population around 20,000. A factory district pounding out supplies for the Imperial Army. Inside the control room, Fluckey gave the order. Surface. Ballast tanks blew. The boat rose. On the bridge, the world was ink black and silent. A faint line of coast barely visible against a darker sea. "Bring us broadside," he ordered. Barb swung until her port side faced the town. Below decks, in the handling space, sailors swore and wrestled with the Mark 51. The launcher had been bolted onto a boat never designed for it, then lashed down for sea. Now they freed it, cranked elevation and traverse by hand. "Range to target?" Fluckey asked the plotting party. 3,000 yards, bearing 145, skipper. Perfect rocket range. He nodded once. "Commence firing." 12 rockets left the rails in a 5-second rippling roar. Fluckey watched them arc out over the water, nearly invisible. Only a faint streak, and then brief stabs of light as their motors burned. A moment later, the shoreline lit up. The first volley slammed into Shari's factory district. Blasts popped across the waterfront. Sheet metal roofs peeled up. Warehouses blew open. Secondary fires took hold where paper and chemicals had been stored too carelessly. By the time Japanese spotters figured out the direction of the attack, Barb had already gone flat to the sea again. "Dive! Take her down!" The rockets were history's first volley from a submarine into a shore target. Over the next 3 weeks, Barb turned that into a campaign. She surfaced in the dark to fire rocket salvos at coastal industry, Shikuka, Kashiho, Shiratoko, Japan's largest paper mill, gone in a rush of splinters and fire. A leather tanning plant that manufactured pilot gear, burning. Small shipyards where late-war gunboats were being fitted, shattered. When rockets were too flashy or too imprecise, Barb used her 4-inch deck gun instead, walking shells into warehouses and barracks. The pattern was always the same. Appear from nowhere, hit hard, vanish before bombers or patrol craft could react. Jeffersonian naval warfare, this was not. This was raiding with a steel sledgehammer. By mid-July, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were flying back and forth over Karafuto and northern Hokkaido. hunting the invisible attacker. They saw wakes where ships had been, smoke where factories were no more, but almost never the submarine herself. And then, on 19 July, while patrolling off the southern Kaputo coastline of Karafuto, Fluckey put his eye to the periscope and saw a new kind of target. Rails. The coastline here was a narrow strip of rock and scrub, squeezed between the Sea of Okhotsk and rising hills inland. A single-track railway hugged that strip, no more than 400 yards from the sea in places. Boxy station buildings, signal masts, cuttings where the track disappeared between rock faces and re-emerged on wooden trestles. 3 days earlier, Fluckey had caught a glimpse of smoke and heard a distant whistle through the periscope. He'd watched as a train clicked around a headland, run by, and vanished again. Now he'd been here long enough to build a timetable. 6 trains a day, sometimes more. Some northbound, some southbound. Mixture of troop trains and freight. The boxcars packed with soldiers, crates, ammunition, sacks of grain, crates of equipment destined for garrisons. Those same garrisons would be manning coastal defenses if the Americans ever came ashore. Barb could have surfaced offshore and shelled the tracks with her deck gun. That would twist rails, knock over telegraph lines. The Japanese would curse and send repair crews. Within hours, the artery would be open again. What Fluckey wanted was shock. He wanted a train destroyed in motion, locomotive, cars, cargo, and men, blown into the air in front of any eyes watching. He wanted a message written in wreckage. You are not safe. Not on the sea. Not in your own harbors. Not even on your own soil. The problem: submarines weren't built to fight land targets that moved. Torpedoes couldn't ride up a beach. Rockets were too inaccurate for a darting goalpost like a train. The deck gun couldn't track across cuttings and tree lines. He needed something else. Something that would let him hit the train from underneath. In Barb's forward torpedo room that evening, 2 enlisted men turned the problem over with calloused hands. Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders. Thick forearms. The sort of man who'd been around guns his entire adult life. And electrician's mate third-class Billy Hatfield. The kind of sailor whose brain never stopped picking at circuits and switches. Fluckey had given them a simple, impossible assignment. Make me a way to blow up a train without standing next to it when it goes off. Saunders stared at the 55-pound scuttling charge sitting on a bench, gray metal dull under the torpedo room lights. It was meant to kill Barb if she ever had to be abandoned. An insurance bomb, wired into the bilges, meant to wreck secret gear so the Japanese couldn't capture it. Hatfield chewed his lip, eyes distant. As a kid, he'd put walnuts on railroad tracks and watched with glee as the train's weight crushed them. Sometimes they exploded into meat and shell. Sometimes they just split neatly. The idea slid into place. What if the train pulls its own trigger? He muttered. Saunders looked over. Hatfield grabbed a scrap of paper and started sketching. A pressure switch under the rail. A simple electrical circuit. The scuttling charge as the warhead. Look, he said, jabbing his pencil. When the locomotive passes, its weight will push the rail down, even just a quarter inch. That closes the switch. 3 dry cells, wired in series, enough juice to set off the detonator. No timer. No wires back to us. The train arms its own firing circuit when it steps on it. Saunders regarded it skeptically, then slowly nodded. If we can keep the whole thing dry and hidden, Skipper's going to like this. By the time Fluckey stepped into the torpedo room, they had a prototype. A simple micro switch, salvaged from submarine components, rigged to clamp under the rail. 3 dry cell batteries in series. A 55-pound scuttling charge, its detonator wired into the circuit. The entire assembly sealed and jammed into an empty glass jar, a literal pickle jar, greased and wrapped to make it roughly waterproof. Hatfield explained. As soon as the locomotive's weight flexes the rail, that switch closes. Boom. No crew standing nearby. No exposed wires. Nothing to give away where we came from. Saunders grinned. We put this right under the sweet spot. Front truck of the loco. You'll take out the boiler, cab, first few cars. The rest pile up behind like a stack of kindling. Fluckey turned the jar in his hands, feeling the weight of the explosives through the glass. How much damage you think realistically? He asked. Hatfield shrugged. At least the engine and first 3 cars. Maybe more if they're loaded with ammunition or fuel. And if it goes off right in front of the station, they'll be shoveling twisted iron for days. The engineering was solid. The tactics were insane. To plant it, Barb would have to surface within about 1,000 yards of the Japanese shoreline. A shore party would have to paddle in on rubber rafts, cross a 400-yard strip of enemy land to the tracks, wire in the bomb, and get back before dawn. If they were spotted on Tivere, Beach, there would be nowhere to run but the sea. If patrols cut them off from the rafts, they'd die or end up in a Japanese prison, interrogated about the very submarine hiding offshore. If Barb herself were spotted, close to land in shallow water, she might not have enough depth to dive and evade. One bomb-laden plane or shore battery could end them. Fluckey did the math. From the moment the rafts hit the water, he could give the shore party maybe 90 minutes before he'd have to pull out and submerge, whether they were back or not. He looked at his men, Saunders, Hatfield, and a handful of volunteers, eager, nervous, grinning like kids who'd just been told they could go light a car on fire for fun. He could say no, abandon the idea, find another convoy somewhere and finish the war conventionally. Instead, he asked a different question. Who wants to go ashore and rob a train for Uncle Sam? The response was immediate. Hands went up. Jokes were shouted. Men elbowed each other aside. The idea of setting foot on Japanese territory, even for a few minutes, was wild enough. Add the chance to blow up a train under the Emperor's nose, and half the boat wanted in. In the end, Fluckey picked 8 men, not including himself. Chief Gunner's mate Paul Saunders, in charge ashore. Electrician's mate Billy Hatfield, the bomb whisperer, and 6 more sailors, torpedomen, signalmen, machinists' mates, fit, steady, good with their hands and their nerves. Fluckey made one thing clear. No officers going, he said. This is an enlisted men's show. If anyone gets caught, you tell them your captain stayed safely in his submarine like a proper coward. He grinned when he said it, but everyone understood the real reason. If the worst happened, the skipper and exec needed to be alive to keep Barb fighting. In the tense quiet just before sunset on 22nd July 1945, Barb drifted underwater off the coast, charging batteries and listening. No sonar pings, no screws. Only the distant rumble of surf sliding against rocks. Above, the coastline of Karafuto lay in a band of dark. A few pinpricks of light marked huts or guard posts that couldn't be fully blacked out. Somewhere behind those hills, Japanese troops were eating rice and counting down the days until the Allies arrived. In the mess compartment, Saunders laid out the gear. 2 inflatable rubber boats with paddles. The pickle jar bomb, wires coiled neatly, tools for loosening rail bolts. Sidearms, a motley collection of 45 pistols and at least 1 Thompson submachine gun. A small American flag, rolled tight. Flag? Someone asked, eyebrow raised. Saunders shrugged. If we live, I'd like to be able to say we planted one on Japan. Fluckey stepped in, looking at the men one by one. You know the risks, he said quietly. You're going in, to enemy territory with no backup. If it goes wrong, I might not be able to help you. There are no medals worth dying stupidly for. If something looks off, you abort. Clear? They nodded. He put a hand on the scuttling charge for a moment. Oddly ceremonial. All right, he said. Let's go a mugga train. Around midnight, USS Barb surfaced in a smooth, black swell. The horizon was a jagged saw of hills against a slightly lighter sky. The air smelled of salt and cold vegetation drifting from shore. On the forward deck, men worked in near silence, inflating 2 small rafts with hand pumps. The only light came from shielded torches cupped in hats and hands. "Keep it down," Saunders hissed. "Sound travels." The pickle jar bomb was lashed in the bow of one raft, additional explosive charges packed beside it to give the main shot more bite. Paddles were soaked in seawater to keep them from squeaking. Fluckey watched from the bridge. "Distance to beach?" he asked quietly. "About 900 yards, skipper," the quartermaster replied. "Maybe 1,000. Gentle current onshore." Not much room for error. When the rafts were ready, the 8 men clambered down over the side, boots hitting rubber, hands gripping ropes. For a moment they hovered between the steel skin of their submarine and the black water below. Then they shoved off. From Barb's bridge, the rafts were almost invisible, 2 darker smudges sliding toward a draped shoreline. "Time started," Fluckey said. The officer of the deck checked his watch. "Shore party away at Durban 15, he murmured, making a note. The 90-minute clock ticked in everyone's minds. Out on the water, Saunders and Hatfield dipped their paddles in unison. No splash, no chatter. The only sound was water moving off the rafts in faint hisses. As they approached, the Japanese coast resolved itself from shadow into form. A pebble beach, then a scrubby margin of dense grass and low bushes. Behind that, the dark cut of the railroad embankment, and beyond it, the hint of telephone poles fading into the night. Somewhere up the line, a station. Somewhere farther, a barracks full of sleeping men. The rafts kissed stones with a soft scrape. "Move," Saunders' wit spared. They dragged the rafts up just high enough to keep the surf from yanking them away, then fanned out in a low crouch. Hatfield hugged the bomb to his chest like a newborn, the glass jar cold under his fingers. The air on land smelled different. Earth, leaves, old smoke. One of the men swore under his breath. "That's Japan," another muttered quietly. "Smells just like any other place." They crossed the 400-yard gap between the waterline and the track, moving in short rushes from one patch of shadow to the next. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot in their heads. Somewhere in the distance, a guard dog barked, then went quiet. They froze, listened. Nothing. Saunders signaled them on. Finally, the ground underfoot changed from soft grass to coarse gravel. They had reached the ballast of the railway. Up close, the track looked ordinary. Steel rails on wooden sleepers, fish plates bolted every few yards, ballast stones tamped around the ties. But this was not just any line. It was a strategic railway on Japanese home soil, part of the skeleton holding the empire together in its last days. Saunders dropped to one knee, running his hand along the rail. Moisture, cold steel, no sign of recent repairs. Hatfield set the jar down gently, unscrewed the makeshift lid, and began pulling out components. "Here," he whispered, handing off the first set of tools. 2 men on the fish plate. Loosen it just enough to let the rail sag a hair when the weight hits it. 2 sailors worked on the bolts, carefully easing them back just a fraction of an inch. No clanging. Every movement was controlled, deliberate. Hatfield slid the micro-switch assembly into place under the rail, wires snaking back to the explosives lying in the ballast between the ties, nested and camouflaged with rock. He connected leads to the dry cell battery series, then into the scuttling charge detonator. Every connection double-checked by touch. "Don't want to trip it ourselves," someone muttered. "Then don't stand on the tracks when the train comes." Saunders grinned in the dark. Time was bleeding away. Back offshore, Barb's navigator was watching his watch and the shoreline nervously. Saunders gave a low whistle. All right, Hatfield, what do you think? Hatfield ran his fingertips over the assembly one last time, then gently lowered the jar and packed pebbles around it. Any locomotive over 20 tons is going to flex that rail. It's not much of a bend, but enough to close the switch. Once that happens, we don't have to worry about timing. He straightened up. That track is now a booby trap. Saunders took a final look around. No lanterns approached. No footsteps on the gravel. No shout in Japanese. He signaled, "Tow. Back to the boats, same way we came. If you hear anything that sounds like an engine, hit the dirt and hold still." They moved off, hearts ticking with their watches. Somewhere in the night, a faint tremor of distant rails sang. A vibration transmitted for miles. A train was coming. Not yet, but soon. By the time they slipped their rafts back into the icy water and began to paddle, the rails behind them were still trembling faintly. On Barb's bridge, a voice called softly down the hatch. "Shore party sighted, skipper. 2 rafts, bearing 170, about 200 yards. Fluckey exhaled through his nose, tension he hadn't admitted to himself draining just a little. "Easy up the ladder," he told the bridge watch. "Let's not silhouette ourselves like idiots." The rafts reached the hull. Men reached for hands and ropes. Boots thumped on steel. One stumble, a muffled curse, then helmets and shoulders cleared the edge of the deck. Saunders swung himself onto the steel, grinning. "Package delivered, Captain," he said quietly. "We even put it under the right track." Fluckey clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Let's see if the train keeps its appointment." They left the deck cleared and stayed on the surface, idling offshore. The night was still mostly dark, but a faint pale smear on the eastern horizon hinted at the approach of dawn. In the control room, some men pretended to do other tasks. Most just listened, to the calm sea outside, to the hum of machinery, to their own breathing. Time crawled. Then, faint at first, growing louder. The distant chuff and clatter of a steam locomotive working its way along the coast. On the bridge, sailors craned their necks toward the shoreline. There wasn't much to see, just a darker strip of land. The sound grew, metal on metal, wind in cars, the industrial heartbeat of a train at speed. Inside Barb, men pressed closer to pipes and bulkheads, as if they could hear better through steel. When the train was almost abeam, the sound filled the world. Wheels hammered joints. The whistle gave a short, arrogant blast somewhere inland. And then, a flash bloomed on shore, followed an instant later by a concussion that thumped chests even out at sea. The night sky lit, silhouetting the low hills and a rolling ball of fire where the track had been. "Holy!" someone blurted. Sea cut off by the roar of the explosion's echo. Inside that instant, 55 pounds of explosive, plus whatever the first cars were hauling, had gone off directly under the locomotive's boiler and forward trucks. The scuttling charge did its job. Steam, metal, and human bodies exploded upward. The locomotive tore itself apart, dragging the first few cars into a twisting tangle. The rest of the train, momentum unchecked, plowed into the wreckage, jackknifing, flipping, piling up into a mountain of contorted steel and splintered wood. Secondary explosions winked as ammunition or fuel on board cooked off. Flames leapt along the line. On Barb, men erupted into muffled cheers and backslaps. "They did it!" someone said. "They really damn well did it!" Fluckey watched the burning line through his binoculars, his face tight but satisfied. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "you have just witnessed the only U.S. ground attack on the mainland of Japan." He paused. "Let's not give them a second chance to shoot back. Dive the boat." Barb slipped beneath the surface as chaos unfolded onshore. Japanese soldiers and civilians would spend the rest of that morning pulling wreckage and bodies off the track, trying to piece together what had hit them. It hadn't come from the sky. It hadn't come from the mountains. It had come, impossibly, from the sea. In the official war diaries, the event barely fills a few lines. On 23 July 1945, USS Barb's 12th patrol includes the entry for demolition of train and track on Karafuto coast. The language is dry, clinical. Shore party landed, attached explosive charge to railroad line. Train destroyed at 0100. Tracks rendered impassable. The reality was far more electric. That night's raid became one of the most famous and audacious small unit actions in submarine history. 8 enlisted men had sneaked ashore on Japanese soil, planted a homemade IED under a railway, and annihilated a train in motion. It was, as Fluckey later described with a certain wicked pride, the only ground combat mounted on the Japanese home islands by the U.S. Navy. USS Barb returned from her 12th patrol with a resume no other sub could match. 29 ships sunk or destroyed across the war, depending on counting method. The only rocket-firing U.S. submarine of the Pacific War, a record of shore bombardments and industrial raids that stretched from Hokkaidō to Karafuto, and now, a train kill on land. For his cumulative command of Barb, Eugene Fluckey received the Medal of Honor and multiple other decorations. His crew collected battle stars, unit citations, and a lifetime's worth of sea stories. After the war, Barb was eventually scrapped, but her memory didn't die. In submarine wardrooms and veterans' halls, the train story became legend, a perfect storm of initiative, technical improvisation, and guts. Fluckey went on to a long naval career, eventually wearing admiral's stars. Despite everything he'd done, he remained the kind of man who deflected praise toward his crew. Ask him about Namkwan Harbor, and he'd talk about lookouts on the bridge. Ask him about the train, and he'd mention Hatfield's pressure switch and Saunders' shore party before he mentioned his own name. For the Japanese troops waiting alow, along that railway, the message was brutal. Nowhere was safe. Not even deep in what they thought was their own rear area. Not even on their own soil. For modern readers and viewers, the raid is something else too. A case study in how a commander ignored rigid doctrine when it no longer fit the battlefield. An example of how small units with technical know-how can flip the script on a much larger enemy. And a reminder that war is not just battles of armies and fleets, but also small, precise acts. 8 men on a dark beach with a pickle jar full of high explosive that echo far beyond their immediate blast radius. If you had family in the submarine force, PT boats, or other raiding units in WW2, drop their stories in the comments. These are the men who didn't just follow the playbook, they rewrote it under fire. And if you want more micro-histories about individual crews, crazy missions, and the weird corners of the war, make sure you're subscribed. There are a lot more forgotten raids where this one came from.